Hi, this is Jose Figueroa with an approved workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcome to another week of Bible study. I am glad that you're here as we open up God's Word one more time. Our current series is Rebuilding on the Solid Rock, a study of the book of Ezra. If you're new to this Bible teaching ministry, here is how you can learn more about our work. First, you can go to our website, www.anapprovedworkman.org. That's anapprovedworkman.org. On the website, you can learn more about the purpose of this ministry, our approach to Bible study, and also review our statement of faith. You can listen to previous episodes of our current series or any episodes from the many series we have done previously on the podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, as well as other podcast directories. If you are on social media, you can connect with an approved workman there as well. I'm on Instagram at an approved workman. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/anapprovedworkman215, and we're also on Pinterest, pinterest.com/anapprovedworkman. Finally, if you want to listen or take this lesson in video format, you can subscribe to our video channels on either YouTube or Rumble, and then you won't miss any upcoming episodes. Today we're lesson number 6 in the series Rebuilding on the Solid Rock from the book of Ezra. This is volume 1 of our series After the Exile, a study of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. The lesson is titled Rebuilding Amidst Opposition, Part 2. Our focus passage is Ezra chapter 4, verses 6 through 24. Please find your way in your Bible to that passage. In chapter 4, we see the Jews' enemies conspiring to stop the rebuilding of the temple. In our previous episode, we began our study of Ezra chapter 4. Up to this point, everything has been positive for the Jewish exiles in their return to the land. They received release and support from King Cyrus of Persia. They were divinely inspired to return and to rebuild the temple. They arrived safely back to the land. They had the resources needed for the task of rebuilding the temple. They were one small but unified community, ready, committed to obeying the Torah. They were fully committed to the Lord, and they had just finished the work to restore the proper worship of Yahweh, and they had a great celebration. But as we saw in our study last time, opposition to their work rose, and it will be relentless. Their enemies will try anything and everything to stop the work of rebuilding the temple and the city. And while this chapter begins with the opposition to the temple rebuilding effort, the chapter does chronicle an ongoing opposition during a period of time of about 100 years. It starts in the days of the initial return, but it goes all the way into the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So let's review the principle and application from part 1 of our study. Opposition rises, Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Our principle: God's covenant people will always be opposed by the world system. God's covenant people will always be opposed by the world system. How would I respond to an offer to compromise in my work for God's kingdom? How can I remain firm in the Lord in the midst of relentless opposition? If you missed that episode, I encourage you to either listen to the podcast or watch the video version of that lesson on Rumble or YouTube. In today's lesson, we will conclude our study of Ezra chapter 4. We will see how the opposition campaign against the exiles reached the highest levels of the Persian Empire. It was an effective opposition that put a pause on the work of rebuilding the temple and also on any efforts to rebuild the city. The question is this: given this relentless opposition, is it over for the rebuilding effort? Is it over for the exiles as they seek to rebuild their city and their temple? Here is our lesson outline and goal for our teaching from Ezra chapter 4. Again, we're looking at rebuilding amidst opposition. Last time, we looked at opposition rises, verses 1 through 5. This week, our second division is opposition is formalized, verses 6 through 16. And then our third and final division, operation succeeds, verses 17 to 24. And my goal for the teaching from Ezra chapter 4 is this: to encourage believers to remember that even when you are in the center of God's will, opposition will rise to oppose His work. Again, the goal for the lesson from Ezra chapter 4 is this: to encourage believers to remember that even when you are in the center of God's will, opposition will rise to oppose His work. Let's get started then and go to our second division from Ezra chapter 4. Opposition is formalized, verses 6 through 16. Now, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes as follows: Rehum the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of their colleagues, the judges and the lesser governors, the officials, the secretaries, the men of Erech, the Babylonians, the men of Susa, that is, the Elamites. Verse 10. And the rest of the nations which the great and honorable Osnappar deported and settled in the city of Samaria, and in the rest of the region beyond the Euphrates River. And now, this is a copy of the letter which they sent to him. To King Artaxerxes, your servants, the men of the region beyond the Euphrates River. And now, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Verse 13. Now, let it be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom tax, or toll, and it will be detrimental to the revenue of the kings. Now, because we are in the service of the palace, and it's not fitting for us to see the king's shame, for this reason we have sent word and informed the king. Verse 15. So that a search may be conducted in the record books of your fathers, and you will discover in the record books and learn that that city is a rebellious city and detrimental to kings and provinces, and that they have revolted within it in past days. For this reason, that city was laid waste. We are informing the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, then as a result of this, you will have no possession in the province beyond the Euphrates River. That's Ezra chapter 4, verses 6 through 16. So let's make our way through this second division. Let's focus on verse 6 first, opposition during Ahasuerus' reign. So this section, when you begin at these verses 6 through 23, what we have is a historical excursus to provide further context to the opposition that rose initially to stop the work of rebuilding the temple, but then went all the way into also opposing the work to rebuild the city and the walls, right, into the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So when you look at this passage, there are several Persian rulers that are mentioned. So I thought it would be useful to summarize their timeline to help us understand this parenthesis in the narrative. So year 538 BC, that's when Cyrus of Persia decreed the return of the Jews. They gave him permission to go back to Jerusalem, to the land. Temple construction began around 535 BC, and this is where we have been so far. Ezra chapters 3 and 4, the days of Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. So here we are. This opposition rises, and it basically, through writing letters and lobbying efforts, etc., they're going to be successful in stopping the work of rebuilding the temple all the way into the days of Darius the First, who became king of Persia and around 521 BC. It wasn't until 520 BC where the work to rebuild the temple resumed, and the people were inspired, encouraged, stirred up by the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. If you were with us during our study of the minor prophets, you know that we went in depth into the study of Haggai and Zechariah and their ministry. The temple was probably completed around 516, 515 BC. Looking at verse 6 here, the king Ahasuerus, he is the one mentioned here in verse 6. That's he came to the throne in 486 BC, and as we will see, he is the king mentioned in the book of Esther. Esther became queen of Persia 479 BC. You had Haman's decree to kill all the Jews around 474 BC, and that's when the Feast of Purim was established. Then move ahead to the year 464. Artaxerxes, which we heard mentioned as we read the passage, Artaxerxes I became the king of Persia, and then it's not until 458 BC that Ezra goes to Jerusalem, and then Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. That doesn't happen until 444, 443 BC. So what you have here is the opposition begins in the days of Cyrus. It continues, stopping the work to rebuild the temple all the way into Darius I, and then through the reigns of Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes, there is constant opposition to the Jewish efforts to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city. So that gives you an idea of what's happening in this passage, and sometimes the names are thrown together. You don't have a lot of detail, so you have to step back and say, okay, what's happening here? Is it the same timeline? Am I looking at a historical context passage? And this is what we have here. So I have a chart on the timeline of the Persian kings, and we will add it to the blog post that goes with the podcast episode. Let's get some additional context for the passage first. Dr. Tony Evans, in his Bible commentary, tells us, quote, that reference to Judah's enemies led Ezra to insert a parenthetical account about other trouble, verses 6 to 23. It probably happened before Nehemiah returned and completed rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. Here, the issue was the rebuilding of Jerusalem, with the opposition beginning in the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus or Xerxes, end quote. And then Dr. John MacArthur also sets us up for what we will see in the next group of verses 7 through 16. He says, quote, he first referred to the opposition from Israel's enemies under King Ahasuerus, a regal title, or Xerxes, 486 to 464 BC, who ruled at the time of Esther. Ezra 4, 7 to 23 then recounts opposition in Nehemiah's day under Artaxerxes I, expressed in a detailed letter of accusation against the Jews, end quote. So that gives us a good context for the opposition. So as we look at in verse 6, is during the reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. He began in 486 BC. So right at the beginning of his reign, these enemies wrote an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Dr. Mervyn Brenneman, in his commentary on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, speaks about the history of opposition against God's people. He says, quote, "The theme of opposition to God's people is prominent throughout the Bible. Whenever God initiates a spiritual work, there will be opposition. But God is sovereign and faithful. His enemies will not prevail. Even a small, seemingly defenseless community of his people can count on his guidance, protection, and power." End quote. So that gets us out of verse 6 and the opposition during Ahasuerus' day. Let's look at the opposition during Artaxerxes' reign in verses 7 through 16. As we look at verse 7, we get some names of the people leading the charge in this opposition in the days of Artaxerxes. Bishlan, Mithredath, Tabeel, and a number of the leading men from among the enemies of Judah. These people, they wrote to the king. We're told that the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic, which sounds a little weird, but it possibly means that the letter was written in the Aramaic script and then set forth in the Aramaic language. It has to do with the language of government, of the empire. That's what it talks about. So you probably had one version of the letter and then one that could be read out loud. In verses 8 through 10, we're told that the letter was written by somebody named Rehum, who is the commander, probably the commander of the army, right there stationed near Jerusalem in Judah. There was somebody named Shimshai, the scribe. And then we're told that the rest of their colleagues, and includes judges, lesser governors, officials, secretaries, joining the effort. So everybody who had anything to do with the government affairs of the Persian Empire in that region, the province beyond the river, basically they were all together in this, and they were not alone. We're told also that the men of Erech, Babylonians, the men of Susa, Elamites, were joined in the opposition as well. And then, if that doesn't stop, finally the people from the rest of the nations which had been deported and settled in Samaria by King Osnapar joined the effort. Basically, this means probably you had this letter and then you had a bunch of people co-signing the letter to show support. One note on King Osnapar. Osnapar was also known as Asnapper, and he's an Assyrian king who deported conquered peoples of various nations to the cities of Samaria. So remember, northern kingdom of Samaria, the 10 tribes. After the Assyrians took over, it was their practice to resettle the population away from the land and then resettle people into the land from other nations. So that's the reference there. And again, we're told here, and as we close in verses 8 through 10, that the entirety of the peoples of the land were united in strong opposition against God's people. So again, small community of faith, small community of the covenant, people loyal to Yahweh, completely opposed by everybody surrounding them, their neighbors and those in power, in positions of authority. Moving ahead to verses 11 and 12, the letter basically said that the Jews were actively rebuilding the rebellious and evil city, referring to the city of Jerusalem, that they were busy repairing the foundations and finishing the walls. Then in verses 13 and 14, these opponents advised the king that if the Jews were successful, they would not pay tribute, custom tax, or toil to the king. Those are different type of taxes, so all of those were collected. So the opponents were saying these Jews are going to just hide in their city, protect themselves, and not pay all the taxes that they're due. Of course, this was mere speculation and lies spoken about God's people. The opposition had no evidence that this was the case. But then again, truth has never been an obstacle for God's enemies. They are true children of their father, the devil. John 8:41-44. These men, of course, claim that they wanted to prevent loss or shame for the king. And I'm sure that was a real reason, right? They only care about the welfare of the king and of the Persian Empire. Sure, that's not what they were doing. They were just opposing God's people. Well, Dr. Derek Kidner, in his commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, provides us with some context of a phrase used here, the Jews that came from you, in verse 12. He says, quote, The Jews who came from you would be Ezra's party of 458 BC, or else a later group. In either case, some years would have elapsed before they could have been ready for the concerted building operation which provoked this letter, after the upheavals and heartbreaks of Ezra's reforms. Everything points to a date approaching the year 445 in which Nehemiah heard the news, which, as I see it, corresponds to our verse 23, and also Nehemiah 1 and 3, end quote. So again, Dr. Kidner is trying to situate this in the timeline. So this letter under Artaxerxes in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, there may have been some efforts already. I remember at this point, 458, 444 BC, the temple has been rebuilt, so the focus is on rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the city, etc. So that's what this letter is probably dealing with, trying to stop the Jews from finishing the work. In verses 15 and 16 of the letter continues that the request is for the king to conduct a search of the record books, to order a search of the records of the empire. He will learn then that the city of Jerusalem had been rebellious in the past and detrimental to the Persian kings and also the Babylonian kings. The city had revolted against kings, and that's why it had been laid waste, probably speaking about the days of Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. So the enemies of the Jews stated again their main point. If the city was rebuilt, it would result in great losses to the empire in the land of Israel. Well, that brings us to the end of this second division. Opposition is formalized. What's our principle? God's covenant people will always be opposed by a lying enemy. God's covenant people will always be opposed by a lying enemy. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? It is because you cannot listen to my word. You are of your father the devil, and do you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he tells a lie, he speaks from his own nature, because he is a liar and the father of lies. John 8:43 through 44. How would I respond to lies about my integrity and my work for God's kingdom? Let's bring this home and go to our third and final division from Ezra chapter 4, Opposition Succeeds. Verse 17. Then the king sent a response to Rehum the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and to the rest of their colleagues who live in Samaria and in the rest of the provinces beyond the Euphrates River. Peace, and now. The document which you sent to us has been translated and read before me. And a decree has been issued by me, and a search has been conducted, and it has been discovered that that city has risen up against the kings in past days, and that rebellion and revolt have been perpetrated in it. Verse 20. That mighty kings have ruled over Jerusalem, governing all the provinces beyond the Euphrates River, and that tribute, custom tax, and toll were paid to them. Now issue a decree to make those men stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until a decree is issued by me. And beware of being negligent in carrying out this matter. Why should there be great damage to the detriment of the kings? Verse 23. Then as soon as the copy of King Artaxerxes' decree was read before Rehum and Shimshai the scribe and their colleagues, they went in a hurry to Jerusalem to the Jews and stopped them by military force. Then work on the house of God in Jerusalem was discontinued, and it was stopped until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. That's Ezra 4:17 through 24. Let's start looking at this division by first looking at the response by Artaxerxes, verses 17 to 22. In verses 17 and 18, we see that the king responded to the letter from Rehum and Shimshai and the rest of their colleagues. He had received the letter had been translated and read to him. In verses 19 and 20, he simply says that he issued a decree as they requested, and there was a search of the royal records. And the analysis, the search confirmed that the city of Jerusalem indeed had been rebellious against kings in the past. And it was also discovered that mighty kings rule over Jerusalem, that govern all the provinces beyond the Euphrates River, and that tribute, custom tax, and tolls were paid to them. And this is probably referring possibly most likely to David and Solomon. In verses 21 and 22, then Artaxerxes says that he issued a decree to stop the work of the Jews, so the city would not be rebuilt until he issued another decree, because he agreed with them and he did not want to risk his kingdom suffering any loss of revenue or encourage rebellion. In his commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, Dr. Derek Kidner speaks about this reference and how it might have set up Nehemiah's work. Quote, "The great days of David and Solomon, and even their most spirited successors, belong clearly to a vanished era. But there is a gleam of good sense in the last clause of verse 21, until a decree is made by me. It made a policy review possible, and with it, by the grace of God, the mission of Nehemiah." End quote. Now let's move to verses 23 and 24, the result caused by Artaxerxes' decree. In verse 23, as soon as the letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai and the rest of their cohorts, they used military force to stop any construction work that was going on in Jerusalem. They wasted no time. Dr. Tony Evans speaks on the main motivation of these enemies of the Jews. He says, quote, "The Jews' enemies knew that if they could neutralize the construction, they could neutralize the temple, the walls, the city, and the community. And if they were successful in all this, the influence of God's people would be neutralized. In other words, the enemies had an anti-kingdom agenda, and it was successful for a while." End quote. In verse 24, we are told that the work to rebuild the temple was stopped until the second year of King Darius. So the narrative in verse 24 picks up back to the work to rebuild the temple from verses 1 through 5. And Dr. Kidner speaks about how this sets up the continuing narrative in chapters 5 and 6 of Ezra. He says, quote, "The time is again that of Zerubbabel," finishing with the same phrase as in verse 5, "the reign of Darius the Persian." But we are now told what the earlier statement stopped short of saying. First, that the work was not only hindered, but halted. And secondly, in what year of Darius the deadlock was broken. End quote. And it's that second year of the reign of King Darius the First. So in spite of all the listed opposition and the terrible things done to the Jews, the chapter ends with a note of hope. The work is paused but not stopped. It will resume and it will get completed. The pause in this work to rebuild the temple will last between 16 and 18 years. But again, God's work is never stopped. That is the end of this third division and Ezra chapter 4. What is our principle? God's covenant people know his plans will be fulfilled. God's covenant people know his plans will be fulfilled. Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name. For you have worked wonders, plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. Isaiah 25, verse 1. How would I respond to the opposition seemingly succeeding in stopping my work for God's kingdom? How am I encouraged knowing God's plans are perfect? Well, that's our lesson for today. How can we apply what we have learned in Ezra chapter 4? Let me start with an illustration. My wife and I love to take road trips. We hate the hassle of airports and air travel. It's just simpler for us to just pack and go. And while I have no sense of direction, She is a fantastic navigator. Still, we are in the 21st century, so we rely on the GPS software in our phones to map out our route. We set the destination, and the software does the rest. It provides multiple routes and also is capable of warning about potential roadblocks or detours. The system does one more thing for us. It provides an ETA, an estimated time of arrival. It tells you when you should expect the journey to be completed. So when I think about what the Jewish exiles experienced and what we might face as believers, I thought about some applications from our study of Ezra chapter 4. Let's talk about God's ETA system, because we need some guidance and some hope. What does the E stand for? Expect opposition to God's work. The exiles knew they were going into hostile territory. Yet, they also knew they were in the center of God's will and had the support of Cyrus. But opposition rose quickly, and I think it caught them by surprise. It seems that they were distracted and discouraged because they were not ready for the challenge. You and I know the enemy and the world system will oppose us precisely because you are in the center of God's will. So that's the E in God's ETA system. Expect opposition to God's work. Then next, the T. Trust in God's sovereignty and strength. We don't see a response from the exiles to the opposition. Everything goes quiet. All we know is that the work stopped. It stopped again for 15 or 16 years. But, and we can only wonder, what if they turned to Yahweh at that time? Would things have changed? For us, the challenge is to trust the Lord and find our strength in Him in the midst of the trial or opposition. He is still Lord and in charge. So we have the E, expect opposition to God's work. The T in God's ETA system, trust in God's sovereignty and strength. Finally, the A, await for God's deliverance. As you can see, the exiles were forced to wait. It would take the encouragement of 2 prophets to get them back to work in rebuilding the temple. Still, they were ready to go when the call came. They responded. We need to wait and trust in the Lord to deliver us from opposition. Before we close, I want to leave you with the encouragement from the Apostle Paul as we go into this next week, knowing we are in a battle, knowing we can trust God and that He will give us the victory. I'm reading from Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the full armor of God, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, so that you will be able to resist on the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. That concludes our teaching from Ezra chapter 4. Thank you for being here today. In our next episode, we will begin our study of Ezra chapter 5 as the exiles resume the work of the temple rebuilding. Until then, this is Jose Figueroa for an approved workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. May God richly bless you.